Hello, and welcome to Train Signal. I'm Don Jones, and this is the Introducing the SQL Server Management Studio lesson of the Database Administration Fundamentals course. In this lesson, I'll be introducing you to SQL Server Management Studio, the primary graphical user interface used to manage and interact with SQL Server as an administrator. I'll show you where to get the studio. We'll briefly explore the interface to familiarize you with where things are, identify some of the key objects that you'll be working with. I'll show you how to execute queries, which will be a big part of what you do in Studio, and briefly mention some other tools that you might need to know about when you start administering SQL Server. Once again, SQL Server Management Studio, or just Management Studio, or some people will call it SSMS, is the main graphical user interface by which SQL Server is managed. It includes capabilities for issuing queries, reviewing query results, creating and modifying database schemas, and, perhaps most importantly, managing server and database security. You typically install SQL Server on your computer and select the option to install just the administrative tools. In other words, you'll go grab whatever SQL Server DVD your company has laying around, pop that in your client computer, and rather than having it install SQL Server, you'll just select the option to install the admin tools, and that will get you Management Studio. If you're using SQL Server Express editions, then you would download Management Studio either separately or as part of the SQL Server Express package, and you would do that from download.microsoft.com. You do need to make sure that you get matching versions. For example, there's SQL Server 2005, SQL Server 2008, and SQL Server 2008 R2, as well as SQL Server 2012. So lots of different versions of this, and you want to make sure you get either the same version of Management Studio that you're using for SQL Server, or it's okay to get a newer version of Management Studio usually. The newer versions of Studio are able to connect to older versions of SQL Server. If you're working with SQL Server Express, there's usually a separate package that includes both the Express SQL Server as well as the Express Management Studio. Now keep in mind that Management Studio does not need to be installed on the computer that's actually running SQL Server. It's much more common to install Studio on your client computer and to allow it to then remotely connect to one or more SQL Server computers. While you're working in your practice lab, you can install both SQL Server and Management Studio on the same computer and operate completely locally. It's not really a realistic production scenario, but it is more convenient for lab purposes. The SQL Server Express edition is free, and it makes a good lab or testing environment, but do note that its Management Studio, so Management Studio Express, is somewhat dumbed down from the full version. There are a few things missing from it. Once you're in Management Studio, you'll primarily rely on Object Explorer, which lets you browse SQL Server's major elements and components and to create and modify database schemas and database objects. Getting familiar with all of these various components will help you become more efficient in the console. Let's take a few minutes and briefly explore SQL Server Management Studio so that you can become familiar with where all of the major items are located. This is SQL Server Management Studio. Now, it really only becomes useful once you've connected it to an actual instance of SQL Server, so I'll use the Connect menu to do that. I'm going to connect to the server that's running on my local computer. That's what the local host means. And specifically, I'm connecting to a named instance. We'll talk more about that in later lessons, but for right now, my named instance is SQL Express. I'll hit Connect. And after a few moments, the tree view on the left-hand side of SQL Server Management Studio will populate. This is the Object Explorer. It's where I can see all of the different database objects that live on my server. For example, if I expand the databases portion of the tree, it'll show me that I have several system databases. You don't mess with these too much. These are the things that SQL Server uses to run itself. And I also have the AdventureWorks 2008 R2 sample database. I can expand that and see all of the different tables within the AdventureWorks database. I can see its stored procedures and other programmability items. Check out any views that may have been created inside this database. So everything in here lives entirely within that database. Everything else, these other 4 folders here, are top-level server-based objects. In other words, these don't have anything to do with a particular database, but are rather associated with that entire instance of SQL Server. So I have security such as logins, server roles, and credentials, different server objects like backup devices, server-level triggers, and any linked servers that this server is connected to. I can manage replication from here. Then I've got several different management tools, including SQL Server logs, policy management, and so forth. Once you select a particular item, sometimes you'll see something pop up in this right-hand pane over here. In this case, I've just selected a database. There's nothing for it to really show me, so I can start browsing through until I get to an individual table. Right-clicking is often your best way to find out how to do something. So here, let's see, I can design the database. That's when I'll start getting some details in this right-hand pane. And this is going to allow me to work with the database schema for this particular table. I can see all the column names that have been defined, the data type that each column supports, and some constraints, such as whether or not this allows nulls. Shooting down here to the Column Properties tab, I can get even more detail. For example, I can see that this column does not have a default value. So you can scroll down here and get lots of information for an individual column. If you're going to be working with a database, this is sometimes a really useful place to start because it helps you familiarize yourself with how the database is put together and what the database will and will not allow you to do. You can also get to the data within. Let's pick a different one here. How about person.address table? We can come down to select the top 1,000 rows or edit the top 200 rows. The only reason it restricts you to the top rows is because if a database has got, or a table actually, has got millions and millions of rows, you don't want to incur the performance impact of trying to query all of those into one table view over here. And so this is what that is. This is a table view, or a grid view, if you like, of all the data that's in that particular table. I can scroll down and click in any of these fields to edit them. Scroll off to the side. You can see that it did, in fact, click the 200 rows for me. I can click to move through those. So just a brief, simple way of working with data tables and the data that's in them. You're probably not going to spend a ton of time working with data like that, but it is a useful way to just briefly get in and make a change, especially if you're just sort of experimenting with SQL Server. SQL Server Management Studio also includes Query Analyzer, which is used to execute queries and examine their results. Query Analyzer also provides tools for breaking down and analyzing both query performance and query execution plans so that you can fine-tune your queries to not only get the exact results you need, but also to get better performance from them. Let's take a look at Query Analyzer, and I'll show you how to enter a query and review its results. Query Analyzer is accessed as part of SQL Server Management Studio, and you can get to it simply by clicking the New Query button. You'll notice when you do that you get an extra toolbar up here, and it shows you what database your queries will be executed against. One way to change databases is to issue the use command, which you learned about in a previous lesson, or, since we're in a graphical user interface, we can just use this drop-down list box to select the database we want to work with. That actually does change the tab name, although because the tab is so short, it usually truncates it with those little ellipses in the middle, but you can hover over it like I'm doing here to get a little tooltip to remind you what database you're working with. You can also get up here into this window menu and select from all the different tabs that are open, and sometimes it's a little easier to see what you're connected to right there. So we can sort of expand this, and that'll quickly remind us what tables we've got to work with. Let's just issue a very brief sample query. Select all columns from the person, and this is a neat part about Query Analyzer. It's actually going to do this little pop-up IntelliSense information, this little menu to help me auto-complete the portions of the schema. So let's see, person, and I'll just hit dot to let it complete that. and then address, and I'll hit tab, and I'll hit enter. Now, hitting enter doesn't do anything. You're actually allowed to hit enter and break your queries across multiple different lines. For example, I'll add a where clause, where person dot address dot, and this is where it's now going to pop up the actual column names from that database. City equals Seattle. I believe I saw Seattle as a value in there. So when you're ready to run this, you're going to hit this exclamation point execute button. By default, it will pull back your results into this grid view, so you can scroll through and you can see that I only got the fields where the Seattle column contained, or the city column contains Seattle. Yep, that looks like everything I've gotten. You'll also notice that it gives you different result tabs. For example, because it found some data in here that looked to be geo data, let's see, spatial location, this is probably some sort of geo coordinate. It decided to go ahead and do a map with latitude and longitude lines for me. That's kind of cool. And no messages, just that I retrieved 141 rows, so that's good. No error messages. There's a lot of different things that Query Analyzer can show you in addition to your results. There's also ways to change the way that the results are printed. You can get them in list format, for example, if you don't want them in this grid view. And as you start working with it, we'll see all those different options and things that you can work with. A lot of them are up here on the tool table or toolbar. For example, results to text. And then we'll run the query again. You can see that it changed to just a plain list. You might want to do that if you, for example, wanted to quickly copy some things out so that you could paste them into a Word document and send them to someone. We could have the results go out to a file instead. The grid view is often the easiest way to work with it, just because you can kind of scroll, and it does keep the column headers at the top, so it's a little bit easier to tell what you're looking at if you've got a long result list. As you're working in your lab, you might find it useful to have a database, a sample database full of sample data that you can work with. You can go to download.microsoft.com and enter AdventureWorks into the search field. Now, this will usually get you a result, but recently Microsoft has started migrating some of their sample databases to their open source repository codeplex.com. So sometimes an easier way to find a more up-to-date sample database is just to head to your favorite search engine, type in AdventureWorks sample, and hit enter. That'll let the search engine dig across Codeplex and all the other places where Microsoft might hide these things. There is typically a new version of AdventureWorks to go with each new version of SQL Server. That way the sample database can take advantage of any new features in that newer version of the product. If you have a choice between multiple different types of databases, you want the Online Transaction Processing, or OLTP, database. Now that's different from the OLAP, or Online Analytical Processing. Make sure you get the right sample for the right purposes. That way anything you try to do will kind of work a little bit better. There are a couple of other SQL Server management tools that you need to know about. Now these do not live within SQL Server Management Studio, but are actually separate tools. XQuery is used to query XML structured data that is stored within a database table field or column. SQLCMD, or SQL Command, is a command line tool that's used to execute SQL queries, often as part of automated batch files. So rather than having to go into Management Studio and manually type out a query and run it, you can sort of paste these things together into a batch file and have SQL Command execute them all in sequence. I won't be showing you these tools. It's just important that you know what they do and that they exist in the product. This lesson served as a brief introduction to SQL Server Management Studio. I told you where to get Management Studio, and we spent some time exploring the interface and identifying some of the key objects that you'll work with. I also showed you how to use Query Analyzer to execute queries, and briefly mentioned a couple of other management tools that you need to know about.